Hello and welcome to The Table. This is Edible Empire, a podcast series about the hidden costs of our food. Hosted by Planet Pulse Pacific, we're your hosts, Emma, Ben and Neil, with Kelly on editing. Connecting from across the globe, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians and their millennia of stewardship. We honour their deep, ongoing connection to lands and environments that we discuss throughout this series. So, grabs up, à table, food's ready. Shut up and eat up, lovelies.
We've heard time and again across the series that our food system causes a huge amount of negative impact on social and environmental systems across the world, often offshoring the impacts of Western diets onto the global south. But we're changing tack now, hoping to combine some of the messages of hope that our guests have spoken about into a framework of sorts, thinking about how our global food system might be changed into something more positive, equitable, and fair. In this episode, we explore concrete visions and practical models for achieving the fairness in our food systems, starting at the macro level with Professor Anitra Nelson. An activist scholar at the University of Melbourne, Anitra is a leading theorist on degrowth and non-monetary post-capitalist futures. She challenges us to think beyond the profit motive, unpacking how dismantling corporate-led commodity markets can pave the way for localized, needs-based economies that fundamentally respect both ecological boundaries and human dignity.
To understand how these equitable principles are being put into practice across the Global South, we're joined by Dr. Milian Bilay, the General Coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. Milian brings a powerful perspective on food sovereignty and agroecology, explaining how reclaiming control over seeds, land, and traditional ecological knowledge allows African communities to resist corporate agricultural dependency and cultivate resilient, culturally rich food systems that feed people without exploiting nature.
Moving from global movements to grassroots community action, we speak with Ali Thomas, the co-founder of the highly successful Shrewsbury Food Hub in the UK. Ali shares her practical frontline experience in tackling the systemic absurdity of food waste by building a volunteer-led redistribution network. She details how intercepting surplus food and sharing it across local community groups not only reduces environmental degradation, but actively fosters social solidarity, care, and food security at a neighbourhood scale.
Finally, we turn to the vital question of who grows our food and how, with author, smallholder, and social scientist Chris Mage. The author of A Small Farm Future, Chris advocates passionately for a return to small-scale agroecological farming as a necessity rather than a romantic ideal. He lays out how a decentralized network of diverse smallholdings can revitalize rural economies, restore degraded landscapes, and break the grip of transnational agribusiness to secure a genuinely democratic and sustainable food future.
Anitra, throughout this series, we've seen examples of the agri-food industry not picking up the tab, to quote Raj Patel, leaving a wake of destruction in order to treat food as a commodity. In your view, how is our food system broken?
I think that the amount of meat that people eat is one of the outstanding problems. I just find it absolutely amazing that people don't speak about it more. I think that the degrowth approach to all of these different kinds of issues is not to say people shouldn't be doing something or they should right now change completely, but to try and introduce people to different way, number one, of acknowledging not just the carbon emissions, but the ecological destruction that comes about because we've got crops for meat and for growing meat. So there's this whole long chain. It's so inefficient. So it's people acknowledging that and also working out how they might be able to cut down their meat consumption. And I think that also just understanding that there's a lot of people who might get enough to eat, but because they're not knowledgeable enough about their nutritional requirements, they're really not getting an appropriate, satisfactory diet. And this has a lot to do just with capitalism, basically. And it's a very glaring example of how we have no control whatsoever over our food if we're ordinary Joe Blows who go to the supermarket, and many people are constrained to very limited food sources because of the kinds of society that we live in. So it's very much a multi-pronged approach. I think food is just like, it's massive, and it's one of the most interesting areas to look at. I mean, it's also the extent to which people use up a lot of energy in cooking when you can start with thinking, do I need to cook this at all? And yeah, just like really looking at every aspect of how food is easily wasted, easily robbed of its nutritional values, and all of those kinds of things. And I think that degrowth has an emphasis on conviviality. It's all about us actually enjoying one another's company and enjoying nature a lot more. And like food is just central to these relationships of ourselves with nature and with one another.
You mentioned degrowth there. This might be the first time many of our listeners have heard that term. Can you break it down for us? What does degrowth mean exactly?
I see degrowth as having three kinds of prongs or legs, and it's a movement that primarily addresses the big challenge of having an economic system which is based on continual growth, and we're on a finite planet. Most sustainability perspectives are facing this same challenge, but degrowth in its very name really puts that at the forefront. At the same time, degrowth activists and advocates are equally interested in democracy to the point of direct democracy. They want much greater democracy, so more power for people. With a big challenge such as degrowth, degrowing, politics is really key. And the other economic aspect of it is quite social, and that's to do with the massive inequities that capitalism results in between people. Many economic inequalities, but all kinds of marginalizations and inequities. So I see it as quite a complex and holistic sort of movement, and that was one of the main attractions to me on degrowth. Lots of different options out there, lots of different people saying you could do it strategically this way better than another way.
So it's really about challenging that entrenched dogma of constant economic growth. And how do you think degrowth helps us understand over-extraction and the environmental limits of our current food system?
So there are several principles that degrowth puts into practice in terms of the food sector. And one of those is to emphasize regionalism, growing locally and eating locally. So instead of having long food chains, which typically become imperial in their very character by the nature of trade and all the history of trade, this means that you know where your food comes from. You often know who grows that food, where they grow that food. You can cut out a lot of those question marks that you have when you go into a supermarket. And yes, your food has come from Eastern Europe, or it's come from Canada, or it's come from Vanuatu. And all of the question marks around how it's come by air, whatever. So the idea of everything being as local as possible fulfills numbers of factors at different levels. Sustainable living is most often when you are able to provision for yourself, whether it's housing, clothing, or food, locally. But it's also the most transparent and open way, and it often there's more of an engagement between the producers and the consumers directly. So you can have a say in what you eat and how it's produced, that kind of thing. So locality is one thing. The other aspect of the way that many degrowth, what we call prefigurative practices, or trying to live how we'd like to live in the future, in the here and now, is to act collectively. I mean, typically community-supported agriculture, but you would find that degrowth, community-supported agriculture, has some different kinds of characteristics than mainstream community-supported agriculture. There's much more of an emphasis on being prosumers, that is, in everyone who's in the collective working on the farm, at least at some point, and people who are consuming therefore know what it's like to be working on the farm. And they also have different initiatives in the ways that the community supported agriculture enterprise is funded. So one model, and we've got a chapter in our Food for Degrowth book on an example in Italy, where there are about 100 people in a particular community supported agriculture enterprise. And at the beginning, when they're planning how much food that they will create, and they're just looking at self-provisioning, that's collectively self-provisioning, they will have a kind of auction, they call it an auction, and they will ask everyone how much they're prepared to throw into getting basically as a kind of collective investment in their planning ahead. If they don't, in that first round, manage to achieve the total they need, then they will ask those people who have greater capacity if they will put in some more. And so that's where that equity principle comes into place. So people are not just doing things locally, and they're not only directly involved as much as possible in self-provisioning, and that's collectively self-provisioning, but also they're really concerned in trying to overcome equity from the get-go, even though the real problem with the inequities are actually structural. They come from a different source than that particular enterprise or that particular community-supported agriculture group. Yeah, so those are some of the ways in which degrowth is a little bit different from other sustainability initiatives that might be locally interested in this kind of thing, but they tend to have longer chains, like they might have 100 kilometers, limit or something like that. Degrowth really tries to go as far as possible and be as directly involved as possible.
And thinking practically, what kind of actions or interventions should we be adopting to move us towards degrowth?
I think that if you look at organic farming, agroecology, permaculture, you're looking at diversified farming and localized farming. And I just think that there should be a policy that just ramps up these kinds of initiatives madly right away. I've got a friend who's just come back from Queensland to Victoria and just said that she was really grieved to see hundreds of hectares of various crops just going on for kilometres as she's driving down the highway. This monocrop, it's not ecologically sustainable, but it's not sensible. I mean, it's very clear that pests are attracted to these kinds of conditions where there's too much of one kind of plant or another. So going back to more diversified food production that's close to where people are living and, cutting down the transport, all of these kinds of things, it would be wonderful to see some country in the world. We've known all this. We've known all this for decades. United Nations have identified that small farmers and peasants are really actually making the biggest contribution to people's food security and food production. But I can speak to colleagues at my university, and they still have a mentality that capitalism is most efficient, big farms, how all of these things, more technologies, all of this makes everything bigger and better. And it's really awful because there are big tensions and fissures between publications and streams of thought in these areas. It's not just climate change that suffers from these kind of dichotomies.
Million, your work revolves around highlighting the need to redistribute power away from corporations in the agri-food space. So, how do corporations and state powers shape food systems?
I think the most important thing that so many people do not understand is the controlling the narratives. That is the source of most of the controls. They say that in African or Africans cannot feed themselves without inviting big business, to come and invest in African agriculture. The land in Africa is severely degraded, so it needs agrochemicals. Land in the hands of Africans is not productive, so we have to invite others from outside and invest on land. Market-based agriculture, farmers have to produce for the market so that they have the money to buy food instead of producing for themselves. It's a very powerful narrative. Technology is a very, very powerful one, The way farming is happening in Africa is backward, so we have to bring in technologies, Now the biodigitization coming forcefully into the continent also. Yeah, it reshaped the narrative. That narrative shapes the policy that is going to be produced. When they hammer you with that narrative, then you believe that yes, there is a problem in your system, and these people, they are feeding their own people, their own country, so they must have been doing something good in their own continent. So we have to listen to them and adapt the kind of agriculture that they're suggesting. So the policies are changed. Education system supports by producing, thousands of people who do serve this system, and these people are in all government bodies, and later comes focusing on few productive seeds for external market. So that's how it's shaped.
And your work really revolves around this concept of food sovereignty. Can you define that term for us, please?
I mean, you have to differentiate it with another word, which is food security. It's good to be secure in your food system, but as Raj Batal said one time, a prisoner can also be food secure. The food security is nearing into food sovereignty because previously they were talking about availability, access, usefulness, stability. Now the idea of sustainability and agency is included in the food security pillars, as one of the six pillars now. But food sovereignty starts by critiquing what I was talking about, the power that certain actors have in the food system. It's very much political because of that. Food security is not as political as food sovereignty. And importantly, it talks about the control of the economy by those who are producing the food. Who controls the sale of your product you produce from your farm, and the right to produce what you want. And also, food sovereignty includes producing without harming the environment. Ecological security is very much important. And much more importantly and significantly for us in Africa, as we understand it now, is food sovereignty talks about the cultural appropriateness of food. We have a campaign here in Africa which we call "My Food is African." It's not simply because our food is better than anyone and whatever, but we have plenty of diversity of food wherever you go in Africa. That's based on the plants that you have, on the seeds that you have on the land, the diversity of the land that you have. We have so much. So the cultural appropriateness of food is very much important, and food sovereignty responds to that because it gives huge emphasis to culture.
The campaign you mentioned there is probably a perfect example of this. But what are some of the practical ways that you see communities and farmers and policymakers working to support sovereignty at the moment?
The campaign and the advocacy works are very much important, but much more importantly, we're pushing for agroecology. Agroecology is nature's ways of production. Agroecology is about interdisciplinary science. It's based on science, cutting edge science. But also agroecology includes social movements. Social movements are important because we are critiquing the system. We're talking about raising the voice of farmers. We're talking about creating relationship with various actors, not only with food actors, but those actors working on health, on the technology, on whatever. So agroecology, promoting agroecology is very much important. It also needs policy support. Now you hear so many African countries talking about food sovereignty, but what they call food sovereignty and what we call food sovereignty sometimes are not similar. For them, for some of them, food sovereignty is producing your own artificial fertilizers and pesticides, without relying on outside actors. But for us, I think I've clarified what it is. So yeah, it is the policy work is important, the resistance is important, and what you do on ground through agroecology is also important.
And are there other areas where you're seeing particular actions or policies that really work to keep that disproportionate power at bay and give people agency?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can go to Kenya and can give you an example of a really exciting process that's happening. The constitution of Kenya allows each of the counties. Kenya is divided into 47 counties, some big, some small, and each of the counties have their own autonomy to produce their own policy, strategy, and action plan, and whatever under the bigger agenda, actually, but not specific to probably agriculture. So some of these counties have developed an an agroecology strategy. And after developing an agroecology strategy, then they have detailed it and they have developed an implementation plan. It's a marketing plan, with agricultural products because agricultural products because they understood that some health problems are rising. For example, cancer, diabetes. There are other actors in respiratory illnesses are increasing food-related problems. So the community also saw a business opportunity. If they produce healthy food and package it and sell it, they get more income. So that experience from one county, this Muranga County, is spreading. And what is good is also the Kenyan government has produced an agroecology strategy as a country. And now, as I speak, a number of countries have already developed an agroecology strategy, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda is in the process, and West Africa in Togo. Senegal is preparing a consultation, a public consultation on agroecology. Chad is also in a process. The Tunisian government is very much interested in developing an agroecology strategy. Central Africa, Cameroon and DRC are also interested in agroecology strategy. So that is spreading, this agroecology. That would help us to create a resilient agricultural system, a resilient agri-food system at the countries when it is applied in its true sense. Some see agroecology as a technical movement, as a technical solution. It's much more than that. Some people even say that is kind of a lifestyle. But you always have to have a change in thinking, change in narrative, and the narrative is slowly changing, and we are working towards that.
A change in narrative. I love that. Ali, Moving on to think about a different side of the food system, but one that a few people have so far mentioned, let's talk food waste. Why is it that food gets wasted?
If you've got a supermarket telling you that you have to produce 100 pallets of chocolate puddings by next Tuesday, and if you don't, I'm going to fine you. You will get a fine if you don't produce, if you don't hit your contract. So the food supplier says, well, I don't want to lose my contract with that supermarket because it's very useful. So I'm going to 10% extra in production. Nothing goes wrong in production. So you've got 10 pallets left over. You make 110 pallets, you've got 10 pallets left over. But that is 10 pallets left over on every single product that is manufactured anywhere in the world. Because it's better to waste the food than to lose the contract or pay the fine. They would rather waste the food because food is a commodity. In a business, food is your raw material, like whatever else would go into an industrial process. So that's a big issue where we've got punitive contracts. If you didn't have punitive contracts and there was some leeway, and apparently some supermarkets say, well, you know what, we want 100, but 95 will do. Okay, so you're not going to get fined if you don't hit 100 pallets. So you might say, well, I'll make 105 then instead of 110, and you've halved the surplus. So there are big things that need to happen in that system, whereby wasting the food's got to be more costly than the punitive contract. We've got to tip the balance because we shouldn't just be producing too much for the sake of it. And then supermarkets, well, the reason food is wasted in supermarkets is because, I mean, I don't know who'd run a shop. Who'd run a shop when you don't know who's coming through the door? They're pretty damn good at it. They're pretty good at not wasting food, but their ordering system is 6 months hence. So if your weather changes dramatically or something happens, like there's a storm or there's a general strike or there's some sort of situation that's different from the previous year, then supermarkets are unable to steer the ship. The ship is coming. It's coming into your store whether you like it or not. People's consumption patterns are really closely related to weather. So if it's absolutely tipping down, nobody goes shopping. Right? So the next day, we know we're going to have loads of bananas because bananas are the most perishable item in a supermarket. It's what every family will buy bananas when they go through a supermarket. But if it's tipping down with rain, you might go, well, we'll have egg on toast for tea and we'll go to the supermarket tomorrow when it's not raining. That's a disaster for the perishable bananas. And we just go, okay, it's going to be a banana day tomorrow. The surplus is very predictable in that sense. The big issues are best before dates. This lunacy that exists, which is a best before date, which is about quality and not safety, which somehow has got into the psyche of anybody under the age of 40 that you shouldn't eat food past the best before date. Whereas people who are older than 40 grew up when there weren't any best before dates. So we don't take any notice of it. Use by dates, absolutely. We do need to be careful on food safety, but best before dates are a nonsense. Tends to be because we've put it in a bag. We put a potato in a bag, which then tells you when it can be eaten. So there's those things that are also need to change. Eggs is a perfect example where you have an egg box with 2 dates on it, a display until and a best before. The display until is a week before the best before date. And eggs are absolutely fine 3 weeks past their best before date. So you literally, that is being displayed until a certain date, which is 1 month before that egg would be even remotely going off, which is crazy, And if food hubs or food projects like ours don't exist, those eggs are going in the bin, which is, when animals are involved, that's just a crime, really. There are lots of reasons why food waste happens. Genuine accidents in manufacturing where the lids of yogurts have gone on backwards. So instead of forest fruit and strawberry, you've got strawberry and forest fruit. Clearly, they can't sell it. Unfortunately, most of the issues are branding issues, where the brand isn't happy with the colour of the packaging, how it's come out. So they'll waste the food because it doesn't look right. There's that. Again, I think we might have gone too far when it's the food inside that's important, not what the packaging looks like.
And how exactly did you get involved in food waste?
I've worked in waste for a long time. My whole career was based, I started in industrial waste up distillation columns in ICI and then went to live in Central America and worked on palm oil plantations, looking at the impact of a lot of industrial agriculture and the impact of that on the environment. And then we came back to the UK, and I worked with domestic waste and recycling and on community engagement, and food waste is the biggest issue that exists in terms of a massive problem that doesn't have to be that way. So back in 2011, we started a service called Waste Management and Recycling for events and businesses. And since that work started, we began to realise what a huge problem there was in terms of how to deal with food waste. And particularly this area of food waste that isn't waste. It's perfectly good. There is absolutely no reason why it shouldn't be eaten. So once we'd identified that there was this surplus food sloshing around in the system, we thought, well, we'd better do something about that. So Katie and I set to and decided that we would try and set up a hub which linked so that we would pick up all the surplus food that was available from farmers, manufacturers and supermarkets and find the organisation that could use it best. What tended to happen would be that somebody decided along the line is that you just link a supermarket with a charity and that's your job done. Well, the problem with that system is that the scouts might pick up on a Tuesday night and there might not be anything. And then the hospice might pick up on a Wednesday night and there might be some sliced bread, but there might not be any veg, etc., etc. So those relationships don't last because the charity isn't getting what they need. They're not picking things up, and so it all fell apart. So we decided that we should create a hub where we would collect everything and then we would sort it out and deliver it to organisations that could use it. So we would collect on behalf of all the organisations that might be able to benefit from that food, whether you be a school or a youth club, a charity, a food share, whatever it was, we can then pick the food up and make sure that they get what they can use. Because if you're sending people things that they can't use, they're going to waste it anyway. So we felt the best way would be to just give people what they needed. So we send bread and fruit to schools because we know that's really helpful. We'll send snacks and cakes to coffee mornings because we know they'll use that. And we'll send vegetables to the hospice because we know that those will be used as well.
You said before to me when we've chatted about the food hub in the past that in an ideal world, it would cease to exist because you wouldn't have that waste in the system. Can you tell us more about that theory of change?
Well, exactly. We would love to mop ourselves out of the building, Neil. That would be absolutely brilliant. You know, the idea if a supermarket just turned around and said we haven't got any waste, absolutely brilliant. And we do see improvements. You know, there have been improvements along the way. They are changing. They're taking a use by date off milk, for example, and making that a best before. So that's less rigid. There was a few years ago a revolution with loose fruit and veg, which means it hasn't got a date on, which is also good for reducing food waste. There are two things that need to happen. One is it needs to be handled properly. There are always going to be mistakes in a food system, and therefore there will always be some waste. There might be some over-ordering because of the weather. There might be a pallet load of cereal that gets dropped off a forklift, and then all the outside packaging there is going to be something. What needs to change is when you're putting in planning application for a new supermarket, within that footprint of your new supermarket, it needs to say, and this is the area that we're going to deal with surplus food. So, which is perfectly good. This is not called food waste. This is food that we can do something else with. We just can't sell it. Now, whether that is going back into their system and then their own supermarket having a seconds outlet, like lots of factories might do, or whether it is, a conduit to come to charities, that's fine. But there needs to be some conscious effort of, we are going to design sorting out, dealing with surplus into the system. We've currently just written to our MP here about a new application for a supermarket because you think, well, why not? The frustrating thing about that we find is that we're so busy doing it, and actually you have quite a lot of experience because we've done it for 10 years now, and we can predict when we're going to get a banana day, and it's cauliflowers when this happens, and it's that when this happens, and it's going to be bread fountain. We know a lot. We don't have a voice really to influence policy, but we've probably got some really good ideas about what should happen. So another thing that ought to happen is there should be, rather than the very large organisations, of which there are a couple in the country, being the only voice that is heard at policy level, there needs to be an opportunity for all of these volunteer-led organisations which are beavering away, potentially putting a sticking plaster on a bigger issue. The other contentious thing would be to say, Well, what happened if all the charities just stopped overnight and said, you know what, deal with your own, deal with it yourselves? Would we get change faster? Would companies suddenly have to deal with their own food waste? And it's nothing like measuring it and it costing them some money for them to actually do something about it. I do sometimes wonder if we would get there faster if there wasn't this elaborate structure of going, oh, we'll catch it, got it, yeah, got it, because we are driven by two things. We don't want the food to be wasted and we can't affect change at a bigger level, so we collect it and do something with it. And once we've started doing something really useful with it in the community, you want to carry on doing that something really useful in the community. I think somewhere along the line, it's really important to step outside. This is really good for me, actually, Neil, to come and talk to you about this, because I don't get time enough to think about the bigger picture. Maybe we would affect change faster if we didn't exist in some ways.
Turning to you now, Chris, you've been a farmer yourself. What is the role of small-scale farmers globally, both historically and today?
Small is a tricky term because, it's not about sort of some defined number of acres or anything. What it really is, I suppose, is integration into a local food economy generally. The way that the food system has worked is that it's kind of pushed people either out of farming altogether or into producing one or a handful of commodity crops that can be produced most advantageously in any given area and sort of sold into global commodity markets where people have no control over what happens to them, over prices, and that kind of defines community economic dynamics. So I suppose from a sort of political economic point of view, what I mean by small scale farming is essentially communities reclaiming control of food, access to food locally, and sort of being aware of the political and economic and ecological dynamics. And, that's not a straightforward thing. We tend to, community is kind of a feel-good word that conceals many sort of conflicts and difficulties and contradictions, but essentially it's moving away from this idea of sort of global producers and global consumers outside of any local context. So it's farms producing stuff in ecologically and economically appropriate ways locally that are sort of connected in sort of socially rich ways with a community of people using the food or the fiber that they produce. And on the sort of ecology side of it, I mean, most parts of the world have historically developed a kind of low energy input, relatively renewable mixed farming systems that are sort of keyed to place at some level. And what's happened in recent times, largely through the advent of cheap energy, of abundant, cheap fossil fuel, which we know is incredibly destructive in all sorts of ways, climate change, but also destructive of sort of local capacity and local control. So most places have quite subtle and sophisticated traditional agricultural systems that cycle energy, cycle ecological materials, and sort of skim off the bit that we can then use to furnish ourselves relatively sustainably. And we've kind of lost that. And that, I think, is what we very badly need to regain by basically by learning from the past, by learning from how people adapted to local ecologies, not kind of mindlessly replacing it and trying to turn the clock back in any way, but learning the lessons of traditional agroecosystems.
You talk there about a loss of connection with traditional styles of farming. Do you think, to an extent, that there's been a sort of brainwashing to get us to accept that our globalised food system is normal?
There is brainwashing, on the one hand, if you're sort of moderately well off, there's sort of brainwashing that, look, isn't it great? You can buy all this sort of food from around the world, out of season food, all this sort of delicious stuff that used to be very scarce, and now you can just buy it for a few coins down at the supermarket. And then if you're not well off, the narrative is, well, look, it's great that we have this cheap food that can then feed the poor, but we don't really see how that system perpetuates inequalities, and it is based on extremely damaging energy use and destruction of nature, sort of tremendous People talk about the sixth mass extinction, which perhaps has been a long time coming, but it's certainly in a country like Britain, it's biodiversity loss has been massively pushed just over the course of my lifetime in terms of all sorts of practices like sort of field enlargement, loss of hedgerows, herbicides, silage making rather than hay making that has decimated creatures, and we are a bit brainwashed by that. And I think, we're also brainwashed by this progress narrative. That's been a big part of my work, that there's sort of this, the spectre of Thomas Malthus lies behind all this, the sort of notion that if we easily sort of overproduce people and then starve ourselves to death, and what people now call neo-Malthusianism is this brainwashing doctrine that were it not for high-tech, scientific, high-energy forms of modern agriculture, we would be starving to death, that we need all this stuff to feed the hungry. But that's very far from in fact, really, the opposite is the case. So much misery and starvation has been caused by essentially the manufactured scarcities of the global food system and global economy. So yeah, I think we sort of need to get out of that brainwashing. We need to get out of that progress narrative. I mean, at the moment, we're sort of progressing towards catastrophe with climate change and other outcomes. There's not that much to celebrate about the trajectory that we've created. But I think, and that's where, we get into this problem of this sense that local food systems or job-rich, labour-intensive agroecological systems are somehow some kind of romantic, nostalgic thing that's harking back to the past. I mean, we certainly need to get over ourselves a bit and learn from the past, but we can apply modern thinking and be addressing it to modern problems. But yeah, there is this brainwashing that somehow green revolution is a case in point, which, it's always presented as Norman Borlaug sort of invented these high-yielding grain varieties that saved millions of people from starvation. That's kind of the brainwashing narrative that you'll see is the sort of mainstream presentations of that. But people have shown really that wasn't the case. The Green Revolution was always about big global geopolitics and sort of state and corporate control. It wasn't necessary in order for people to feed themselves. In fact, in many ways, it's caused poverty and misery and all the rest of it. So for sure, yeah, somehow, I mean, I've tried to do my little bit in the books I've written, and obviously people doing it in their day-to-day practice of trying to produce food and fibre locally. But it's a very powerful narrative that's hard to overturn, as powerful advocates that have big media platforms. So it's a bit of an uphill struggle.
And is small-scale farming the way to challenge that norm then? Is it the solution to fairness in the food system?
It can do it. It can't do it alone. I mean, I think to some extent there's a political discussion that we need to have that we're not having, which is about fairness, access to land, access to housing. Setting up a small-scale farm in and of itself isn't going to resolve those fairness problems. I mean, there are things you can do. Something that we've worked on in our little community is, well, two things really. One is we set up solidarity boxes. So there's basically where customers who are better off and are happy to pay more for a veg box then enables us to sell veg boxes at a reduced rate to people on lower income. The other thing I think is there's a lot of people of my sort of age who've done quite nicely out of the way the global economy and the way that house and prices have played out over the course of their lifetimes, but people of goodwill who want to put something back into their communities, and without getting into the details of things like land trusts and CSA agriculture and so on, I think there's a lot of potential in unlocking good citizenships of people, relatively small-time people, but who have a little bit of money to actually sort of try and create good local food systems. So, there are things you can do, but really it's kind of the larger system where this sort of stuff is lodged and sort of tends to run aground. But that, going back to what I said right at the beginning, I don't think we can assume that larger system is resilient itself. So, a large part of my writing is about how is this going to play out with climate change, with energy price spikes, with shortages of resources and critical minerals, with geopolitical conflict and breakdowns of various kinds. So I think that's the point at which suddenly a functioning local agricultures are going to become, and you know, we can talk about local at lots of different levels there, even at the national level. I mean, some countries take food security a bit like, you know, military security, take it more seriously than others. But all of this stuff is going to be revving up, I think, as we head into these bumpy waters of global systems. Nobody can predict exactly how they're going to play out in any given area, but I generally think if we have people who are producing food, not only commercially, but also sort of amateur food production, community gardens, allotments, you know, all of this stuff links up. The more resilient we will be, the better resources we will have to sort of weather these storms, which are definitely going to be coming, or are coming, or already here for many people. You know?
Resilience and weathering storms is a really actively hopeful way to end this, our last episode. Thank you so much, Chris, and all of our guests. This has been a really uplifting episode. I think we can all really agree. But if there had to be some key takeaway messages for our listeners, what would they be? Starting with you, Million.
It's very easy to advise them all to eat food produced without, without chemicals, and food they know where it has come from, basically. And also, there are so many communities who are fighting day and night, to really transition from chemical-based agriculture to agroecology. Transition is an opportunity cost. It's not easy. If you were using agrochemicals on your farm for 20, 30 years, or even 10 years, now to transition to agroecology is an opportunity cost, because the land has to be built first. The soil has to be ready. So that bit needs to be supported. Supporting the transition of farmers is also very much important practically in terms of resources. Now the global geopolitics is shifting, in the resources for this kind of work is diminishing. So the people have to step up, to support this kind of initiatives.
Anitra?
Yes, well, I think that direct action and action locally is really important for everyone to feel more empowered, because there they do feel that they get somewhere by being involved with people, by talking with people, by learning new skills. If they have real problems thinking about the whole world collapsing or whatever, if they have more skills and knowledge, then they feel empowered. The issue about Indigenous peoples is really, really an important one. In my local area, it's really wonderful. There are some Indigenous people who hold market stalls where they share seeds as well as plants. They always tell the stories about their plants. It's such a greater enriching kind of cultural experience to be talking about food with them. Also, in our book on food for degrowth, we have a couple of chapters. One is on the Cree in Canada and how they're investing time and energy into marrying traditional ways with their ways of living, improving the nutrition of the people within their community, getting that conviviality of all working together. There's also an interesting chapter about women in Kenya who've left rural areas and the kinds of local foods that they really love and know how to cook. They go to cities where they have to go to a supermarket. These are really vegetables and fruits and grains that they're not familiar with. They don't know how to prepare them well. They don't like them. They've managed to develop their own informal food chain back to the rural areas and import themselves the foods that they love from their home areas, and they have kitchen parties or gatherings where they share that food with other Kenyan women from rural areas, and they show their children. So they're actually developing ways of bringing back their traditions and improving the knowledge of their children into the future. They don't go to the supermarkets. So this is all kind of building up the alternatives. So there are a lot of parallels and a lot of alliances between people who might come, for instance, to Australia as migrants. And yes, they enjoy the food that they're familiar with.
Ellie, how about you?
The main message would be get involved if there is something going on in your community and start it. Don't worry about having all of your ducks in a row. The idea of those, with things like this, treat it as action research. Get involved, have a go, see what works. Be prepared to change course. That would be on anything, on any environmental activism or any project that you felt was worth getting involved in. Do it and see. That would be my advice. And don't waste food.
And finally, Chris?
Well, I mean, anything you can do to go outside the normal supply chain. So, do support local producers. There's kind of not enough of them to go around. But, I would say, even if it is a case of going to a local farmer's market that's all a bit kind of middle class and high priced and sort of fancy foodie sort of stuff, don't take that. That is a valid critique of aspects of this, but don't worry about it too much. If you can afford to do it. Support those local farmers who are, trying to do what they can within the existing system. But I would say also don't think about the food system as a separate thing. Ultimately it's about the larger ecology that we have to be concerned with, but also the larger economy and politics. So, this is about distribution of wealth. It is about sort of housing and land costs. So, anything that you can do to help with economic justice globally and locally, I think is a really important part of this. But, do think about the kind of things I was saying, the little things we've done, like the solidarity boxes or trying to set up community gardens, trying to sort of access land and decommodify it. There's always pressure to sort of build houses on land rather than produce food on it because the economic returns to that are disproportionate, but we do need land for food. So in local situation, try and stop that kind of push just to sort of maximize land value and try and help it produce food. And also, as I say, don't be too naive or idealistic about, it's all just food for free and everyone just sort of pitch in. I mean, I've written quite a bit about historic commons. When you look at the way that people organised food production collectively, historically, they were often done very, very, in very careful and considered ways to make sure that the sort of economic incentives were right. So not economic incentives like our modern way of getting the best amount of money or the best bang for your buck, but sort of ways of making sure that people aren't getting burnt out, people are included, people are being justly rewarded for what they put into it. So there are sort of off the peg models for that, but really they have to be worked out sort of in fine detail locally. You can't sort of come up with a blueprint or a generalization, but those are the kind of things to focus on. But I think it starts with just trying to access food and help other people access food locally outside of those mainstream commodity supply chain routes.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode. Thank you so much again for listening. We've covered so much fascinating information from across a huge array of different topics, all related to the food on our plate. But fear not, we're back for one more epilogue episode where we'll be reflecting on some of the recurrent and most important messages from the series.
As always, check out the website thesalmonandthetomato.org for the show notes and more information about the podcast series and the wider project. From Planet Pulse Pacific, from Neil, Ben, Emma and Kelly, catch you next time.